Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to Business Law 1. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 52, which involves international law. Some of the overall learning objectives that we're going to be examining in this chapter include understanding concepts of sovereignty, self-determination, failed states, and failing states. We're also going to be looking at the sources of international law in more detail, so I'll talk about some treaties and conventions as it pertains to how countries interact with each other in the global community. We'll talk about how civil law disputes between or among parties from different nation states can be resolved through either national court systems or through arbitration. And then finally, we'll just take a general kind of like look at how organized states, when we're talking about like national jurisdiction over various parties, differ from country to country. So that's kind of like the big picture of the learning objectives for this particular chapter. Anyway, so when we just talk about the legal background or the parameters when transacting business in an international environment, so let's say, you have a company here in the United States and you're contracting with a company in a different country, whether it be to buy or to sell goods or services, it doesn't matter. At the very base of that relationship is a contract. And in the next chapter we get to, which will be chapter 8, we talk a little bit about the foundational blocks for having a contract. But in an international environment, in terms of the actual agreement, obviously somebody's buying or selling, a good or a service. But also the added layers or the dimensions for an international contract include such items as what national law or framework is going to be applied if there is a dispute. Because usually for every contract that is drafted, there has to be some reference of what laws are we going to apply if there's a dispute. Obviously, if there's no dispute, there's no problem, but, we don't necessarily live in a world where, everything goes perfectly all the time. And so you always have, by default, well, this is the backup plan. If somebody doesn't do what they're supposed to do, how do we fix this? How do we resolve this? And so you have to identify which country, in terms of their legal system, you're going to kind of fall back on if you have to resolve this dispute. So, let's say, you have one party here in the United States, and let's say the other party is in Brazil. Well, okay, I mean, if the Brazilian party would probably prefer to, use Brazilian law, here in the United States, we would probably prefer to use United States law. But even within those parameters, you don't have to be constrained to one of those legal formats or venues. You could select a third country. Sometimes, the framework of the law of either country that you're dealing with in terms of the companies, maybe there is a preferential legal framework that a country is not a party to. And so, even though, we're here in the U.S. and the other party to the contract is in Brazil, we could apply Swiss law, or we could apply, a British law, or whichever. So that gives you a preview or a glimpse of just how flexible and adaptable contracts are. As long as they're for a valid legal purpose, then, your own limitations of your imagination is really the only constraint that you have. Another thing that you have to figure out is, well, okay, even though we're going to be applying, let's say, this country's law, whichever country we're discussing, how are we going to resolve disputes? Because, are we going to go through the court system? Here in the United States, if you litigate anything, it's going to take you a minimum of 1 to 2 years to do anything in terms of litigation. So, and that's here in the U.S. If you go into other countries, I know India, for example, I know Mexico, for example, just to give two other kind of like, instances. Those countries, to go through their litigation process and in their traditional courtroom environment is very lengthy indeed. It's much longer than in the United States. So what usually is the default for most international transactions is binding arbitration. And so if you recall back, earlier in this course when we talked about like alternative forms of dispute resolution, binding arbitration is where you use an arbitrator That person, he or she, acts as an informal judge. They apply the law of whatever, standard is being utilized. So here, for example, whatever country's laws that we're using in this contract, they apply that law. The parties can, submit evidence. They can present oral argumentation, any other written supporting documentation to justify their position, depending on the side that we're talking about, and then they make the decision. That's the role of the arbitrator in binding arbitration. And so in international agreements, that's the preferred norm because it's quick, it's easy, it's fairly inexpensive in terms of the process. Obviously, the result may not be cheap, because of, whatever is at dispute. But that seems to be the kind of like go-to. One final consideration when we talk about like what country are, their laws are we going to be applying, there also is the issue of what currency you're applying. We may just naturally assume, well, okay, we're going to conduct this deal in US dollars. Well, not all of the world wants to convert their currency into US dollars if they're buying stuff from us. And if we're selling stuff to them, they may not want to convert, the currency in reverse. So, that's something that has to be negotiated over all of these terms. Do you want to have binding arbitration? What country's laws are we going to apply? What's the currency that we're going to be using? And depending on the negotiation, how that goes, the strength of both parties, in terms of market share, maybe of one particular, side of this contract, the buyer versus the seller, and what they can expect to demand. That's going to dictate maybe some of these sub terms or sub aspects of the contract for which they're engaging in this business activity. But do know that the norm for most international agreements, as a default, binding arbitration is the go-to as the means to resolve the dispute, as the venue of choice. So when we talk about different forms of how businesses can structure themselves when you're doing business in an international environment, there's different levels that companies can employ. So on a very simple level, and this is at the very top, is export sales. So, it's like, well, okay, I don't want to have a physical presence in another country. I don't want to have to interact with, maybe an agent or some type of representative or sales force on my behalf. I just want to put stuff on the internet, and if somebody wants to buy it and they are across the street from me or across the planet, I'll just ship it, drop ship it wherever, and it doesn't matter. Export sales reflect probably the easiest kind of initial entry into international transactions because it doesn't require much in terms of it doesn't require a deep level of investment. All it takes is just trying to market your product or service in an international environment. Now, the limitations of this is that it's really hard for customers in other countries, through just, maybe an internet presence, to figure out, well, do I want to buy from this particular company, whatever it is they're selling? So the next level is where you're using some sort of contractual relationship with, individuals or entities in other countries. And because of that, you have kind of like a more direct connection with global customers then. So whether you create, like, let's say, a distribution relationship in other countries of the world, maybe you hire, agents, so you have a principal agent relationship. Maybe you engage in licensing or franchising. And so those are effective strategies because that gives you at least some type of presence there, even if it's kind of, by contract, so that, those locals in those other countries can be kind of actively trying to, sell whatever it is, product or service that you're offering. The bottom level there is where you have the greatest level of investment in a foreign country. And so this could either be a wholly owned subsidiary. So now we're talking about either leasing or purchasing land, equipment, building structures, that type of thing. Or it could be a joint venture, which is some modification of that. a lot of countries around the world, there's that phenomenon of like the developed world versus the developing world. And there's a lot of other countries that, that come under that umbrella of the developing status. And they can be somewhat suspicious of the motivations of companies as they come in from other countries, especially Western corporations. And, in terms of exploitation of resources, whether it be like raw materials, labor, and so on. And so a lot of countries do kind of mandate that, if a corporation wants to come in and, let's say set up some type of operation, that's fine. Most countries are very amenable to that because it brings in investment, it brings in jobs, it brings in, it can kind of be a sea-level change at, on a regional or even a national level, depending on the scope of investment. And so with a joint venture, a lot of countries say, well, okay, sure, come in, but we want you to be a partner with a local here. And so that partnership provides some kind of like, I don't want to say a check and balance because that's more of a governmental term, but it provides oversight so that the local, individuals or maybe a company will actually kind of oversee what this foreign corporation is doing. And they just act as kind of like a fail-safe, so that, the corporation that's kind of coming into this other country knows that, they have to be very careful in terms of the actions that they take. But, the overall, like these three-tiered strategy, the export sales, that's a very low investment, low risk. You probably aren't going to get a lot of reward off of that necessarily, or return. You go down this, to the next level where you have the distributorship, agency, licensing relationship. You're costing you more money now. You're obviously going to have to travel to these other countries. But hopefully, because of that increase in cost or potential for risk, you're going to increase your return or your potential reward. And then the lowest level there, that wholly owned subsidiary or joint venture, that's the greatest expense, greatest risk. But then also that's hopefully your potential for your greatest reward then at that point. So, everything's always a balance with anything in life. And for, strategies of entering into other markets to sell goods or services, it's just another instance of that balance that we see in this world. In terms of different international, organizations, I won't go through and read all of these, but I'll go through some of them. The framework post World War II, the Allies, particularly the United States and Great Britain, really wanted to create a global framework so that we could try and advance peace and reduce the likelihood of world war going forward. If you think of the 20th century, in the teens, about a century ago, we had World War I, major, global conflict. Within about 20-25 years, we have World War II, another, very costly in terms of, lives as well as expense and destructiveness with World War II. And so, the United States and Great Britain were like, well, how can we try and avoid this? Because we don't want to see a world war every 20 or 30 years. That's just too devastating on this planet, too disruptive in terms of, global business, opportunities. So what they came up with was a two-pronged strategy. One was, let's facilitate trade, and that's in the form of GATT. Initially, it was called GATT, which is General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And the idea with GATT was to kind of create an agreement where you would have countries sign on to it to lower their tariff or any type of other barrier to global trade. The theory is that if we can trade with each other more, you're less likely to go to war with each other. And that has proven largely to be true. I mean, we certainly, we've had military conflicts since World War II, but we have never had, since World War II, another massive global conflict to that scale. The other kind of prong or their approach was to create a venue for diplomatic relations, and that's the United Nations. And so the idea is that countries of the world can come together, they can air grievances, they can try and form alliances and bonds, whether it's on a regional level or just purely a global level. And those two, that two-pronged strategy has proved to be fairly successful. I always, and I think I probably have said this in here before, so I apologize for repeating myself, but, I think of our current relationship between the United States and China. China does a lot of things that drive us crazy. I mean, that's true. And we do a lot of things that drive China crazy. But right now, there is no other country in the world that can satisfy our thirst for consumer products than China. So China is we have to go to China because they're the ones that make everything right now for a lot of the stuff that we purchase. Not exclusively, but a lot of what we consume does have in part as its origin China. Um, the flip side of that relationship, I mean, there's no other country in the world that buys stuff like us. I mean, Europe buys stuff, but they're not even close to our consumptive capacity. It's like in our DNA. We love to buy stuff, and so China just can't say we're fed up with the United States. Let's just go sell somewhere else. There's no other, country that's as developed enough as us and purchases like us. So we kind of are just stuck with each other for the time being. And, that theory of GATT, at the end of World War II, I mean, it proves to be successful. It's like we'll figure out how to, cooperate and get along with each other. We may, ruffle each other's feathers at times, but we need each other. And because of that trading relationship, it kind of pursues that agenda of trying to have a peaceful cooperation with other countries that otherwise might be antagonistic towards each other or worse. So GATT eventually, by the 1990s, kind of evolves into what is now known as the WTO, which is the World Trade Organization. And again, the purpose of GATT/WTO is to advance global trade. We want to trade with as many countries of the world as possible. The theory is if we can trade with other countries, we'll become enriched because of that, that transactional aspect of that relationship. And hopefully the other countries of the world will also, elevate their standard of living. So it has a dual purpose, promote peace, but also, try and, improve the standard of living and enrich the parties that are involved in the trading process. You have regional trading agreements like the European Union, also NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was recently amended under the Trump administration. But so you have regional trading blocks where, based on just simple geography, countries will give even further preferential treatments for those memberships. So when you think of like North America, the countries of Mexico, the United States, and Canada, they have given each other even more preferential treatment than like WTO does in terms of just general global trading. And there's strategic advantage for that. The European Union, similar to what we have here in North America, they've gone even a little bit further because they have a single currency. I don't know if we ever will kind of evolve to that status. It's possible. They also have the free movement of people, which has not been without controversy in Europe. But you see the idea of where they're potentially headed. Whether it's going to become, a supranational type of arrangement where, there are countries that form the European Union, but then they really kind of, give up some of their sovereignty for this greater kind of like entity that kind of envelops all of, the continent of Europe. I don't know if we actually would kind of go to that extent here in North America, but it's possible. Again, the idea is that, we want to further enrich in the members of that particular regional trading bloc. There also are organizations that are designed, global organizations that are designed to maybe restrict global trading. So not everything is always expand trading. OPEC is a great example of that. That's the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. And the idea there is that they want to kind of regulate the amount of oil that they will kind of extract and distribute on global oil markets as a way of trying to kind of regulate the price of oil per barrel. They've had varying levels of success. It's usually, as oil prices tend to rise a little bit, country members will cheat and they'll overproduce in order to kind of capitalize on that short-term gain in price per barrel. So that's a little bit harder of a thing to manage for OPEC as an overall organization, but that's their stated purpose, is to try and control oil production. globally. In terms of barriers to trade, so this is what the WTO / GATT is trying to avoid are tariffs. Tariff is a tax on a good as it moves in or out of a country, and tariffs are usually the most common barrier to global trade. So the theory is and every country does this, even the United States, is that maybe they want to protect cottage industries or industries that maybe are suffering in some way. And so let's raise the cost of foreign made goods or services that are comparable, that are trying to come into the country. If you tax it as it comes in, then you elevate the cost of it, and then you make it comparable to maybe what the cost is for the domestic industry members. It's a natural reaction, but history has kind of proven that whenever you raise tariffs, you are inhibiting economic activity. And so because I think the theory that a lot of countries have had, and this is partly what made the Great Depression even that much more worse back in the 1930s, is the country saw the slow up in economic activity, and then all of a sudden they're like, okay, well, let's just kind of raise tariffs and we'll force Americans to buy American made stuff. I mean, the theory sounds good. But in reality, it's like all of a sudden you're making foreign goods more expensive, and that has kind of like a snowball effect of suppressing overall economic activity and further exacerbating the economic recession, which became a depression. So you're better off having, low tariffs or no tariffs as a way of trying to keep cost as minimal as possible, and that will encourage, trading, goods and services, within a country or among countries of the world. There's also non-tariff barriers, and so these are not taxes that are being imposed on goods, but there's some other type of restriction that's being put in place. Import quotas are a great example. Again, most countries of the world have done this. We've done that, where we just numerically restrict the flow of goods coming into the United States from another country for whatever purpose. We did it, I think, in the late 70s, early 80s with Japanese-made autos. We actually numerically restricted them because they were kind of offering a cheaper product, better fuel mileage as compared to the original big three auto manufacturers in Detroit, when you think of like Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler. The automotive industry has become totally global now, and it's changed, but back then it was kind of very compartmentalized among the countries of the world, and so it was easy to target maybe a competitive threat and say, well, we're just going to restrict the number of cars you sell here. That didn't really hurt the Japanese auto manufacturers, because then they just started making more expensive cars, and they were still earning the same amount, if not more, in terms of profits and money that was leaving the United States to Japan. So sometimes you think you're trying to help your domestic industries, when in reality you actually are ending up hurting them by doing these tariffs or non-tariff barriers. Another non-tariff barrier example would be like environmentally based restrictions, and that at least I think with that there is depending on what the product is that we're talking about, that is a little bit more of a legitimate concern. So if it's let's say it's toys that have lead paint. Obviously we don't want kids to have toys that have lead in them. Because of the impacts that it has on children's bodies, and so that's an example where you can just say, look, you can't bring those types of products into our country. The last category that I have there is that it's an extension of foreign policy, so these export controls. And there are some limited industries because of the technology that they possess, whether it's aerospace, aviation, if it's some coding or software industries. We don't want to have certain technologies get into the hands of countries that are maybe adversarial with us, and so we do have kind of like restrictions put in place, where if you're a company that is engaged in that type of technology, if you want to sell to, another country of the world, it isn't that you can't. It's just that you have to check with, like the State Department. They have like a commerce control list of, countries that you can trade with, and then within that, specific technologies that you're allowed to transfer with these other countries. So, if we're dealing with, let's say, Canada or maybe Great Britain or France, countries that historically have been very close allies of ours for a while now, maybe you could engage in sale of those types of technologies. But if you're talking about, well, it's definitely not North Korea or Iran, but there's more marginal type, regimes around the world where, again, out of foreign policy concerns, we really don't want to have this technology get into those other countries. So. This is an example, like I've mentioned, with the State Department and the Bureau of Export Administration. They regulate, specific technologies. And the example I give there is, in the world of steel, for example, you think of like, steel girders that make buildings, or, if it has applications for aerospace or automobile manufacturing, there are different grades of steel that exist. And if it's just your traditional construction type grade, that isn't necessarily, it doesn't have, national security implications, but they do have, kind of like when you think of like a weapons grade steel, obviously, if you're trying to sell, let's say, to a Pakistani company, or, some other country around the world where there is some, national security concerns. It's like, well, it isn't that you're going to be automatically precluded. It's just there's going to be tight controls on, well, who are you selling it to? Are they going to be approved or not approved? And again, that's an extension of diplomacy and an extension of foreign policy that we've, kind of nurtured, over the past century. So because of that, we, and these are very fine industries. This isn't like, something that impacts a lot of industries. But if you're in an industry that is regulated in that way, you have to be very careful, because there are severe sanctions and penalties that can be put in place. In terms of governmental regulation, kind of like continuing that conversation, we covered intellectual property in an earlier chapter, and we talked about trademarks, copyrights, patents, trade secrets. In the world of trademarks, there's this thing called counterfeit goods versus gray market goods. Counterfeit goods are just fake goods, and so if it's like a fake Gucci bag, we obviously don't want, someone to profit off of the intellectual property of the valid intellectual property owner. But there is something called a gray market good, and the phenomenon with gray market goods is a really interesting example, because with gray market goods, they are validly produced goods. It's just that they end up in a territory where they do not belong. So if you're a global brand, let's say Gucci again, Gucci handbags. Gucci will, make certain types of handbags for different markets or regions of the world based on local preferences. So, they could have a South American market, an Asian market, a North American market, a European market, an African market. And, let's say that, they ship down a batch of, Gucci handbags to South America. And let's say that for some reason, some of them are not moving. So you have maybe an entrepreneurial, distributor in, let's say Rio, and they have an associate in, let's say, Japan. And so all of a sudden they ship those goods that were destined for South America to Asia. And now all of a sudden these handbags are popping up in Asia that were originally destined for South America. So that's a problem, because the overall global brand wants to try and maintain the integrity of these territories. And so even though it's a legally, it's a valid good, it still is ending up in the wrong territory. So that's that phenomenon of a gray market good. When we're looking at, like, if someone actually is infringing on a mark, the idea of jurisdiction, if you recall, or from earlier in this course, the ability of a court to hear a case. Excuse me. So, sometimes, like in the United States, we have like what's called the effects doctrine. Is that, is it impacting a company here in the United States? And if so, then we can, maybe have jurisdiction to pull that foreign entity into the United States, into our court system. If it's fairly balanced, kind of impact, maybe it's impacting, let's say Mexico and the United States. It's like, well, you know, there could be a degree of discretion there. And so maybe the judges in both jurisdictions can kind of confer and say, well, what would be perhaps the best venue in order to hear this particular case. There are some limited defenses, active state, sovereign compliance, sovereign immunity defense. And so sometimes companies are coerced by other regimes to do or not do certain things. And that offers some limited defense. If it ends up that, it becomes like this issue of, infringing activity. Near the end of the chapter, in terms of relief mechanisms, there are anti-dumping laws and export subsidies, that countries will engage in. We can retaliate if a company in another country is trying to dump onto U.S. markets a particular commodity, good, or service in order to lower cost to hurt a U.S. competitor. We can artificially raise that price, if we can target specifically what they're doing. We're not going to do it in general if they offer a better product at a cheaper price, but if they're just trying to dump onto U.S. markets, that's the concern that what we have. And other countries do the same thing. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, I just briefly mentioned this because bribery is an issue globally. In order to secure a contract, some countries of the world are okay with having some sort of monetary compensation that flows from one party to another, a bribe, in order to receive the benefits of that contract. We cannot do that here in the United States. We cannot do that abroad. So if it's a U.S. company and it's engaging in contractual relationships with entities in other countries of the world, even if it's legal in those other countries, we cannot engage in bribery. I mentioned the Ralph Lauren in Argentina, and there was a case down there that involved a Ralph Lauren executive who actually did, kind of offer a bribe in order to get the benefits of a contract. And they self-reported, which is always the ideal thing, because sometimes, mistakes happen, however you want to label it. And that's a burden that U.S. companies bear. No matter where they are. It's not just in the territory of the United States. It's anywhere in the U.S. Anywhere in the U.S. and the world. U.S. companies cannot engage in bribery. The last topic for this chapter is expropriation, and that's when a country takes, let's say the assets, property, buildings, whatever of a company, and it becomes nationalized. And different countries of the world have kind of been more aggressive with this than others. I think of like Venezuela when Chavez was in charge, and so, whether it's for, defense, natural resources, banking, communications, a lot of different industries get impacted because of this. And so insurance can be sought to try and avoid the fallout of this, as well as careful selection of foreign markets. So anyway. As you have questions on this chapter, please reach out to me anytime, but have a good, safe, and productive week, and I'll be chatting with you all again soon. Thank you.